There are islands off the coast of Britain that do not appear on standard tourist maps. Some have no permanent residents and have not had any for over a century. Some are accessible only with specific permission from the government, the military, or the single private owner who controls the entire island. Some have histories so disturbing that the local fishing communities on the nearest mainland have avoided them for generations. In this video, we are counting down 12 British islands that nobody dares go to. Not because they are remote in the ordinary sense, because the specific combination of what happened on them, what was done to them, and what is still there waiting to be found makes them a different category of place entirely. Stay with me to the end, because the island at number 1 has been empty for over 90 years. The reason everyone left has never been fully explained to the satisfaction of historians, and the physical evidence of what was left behind when the last residents departed has been sitting undisturbed in the same place ever since. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. 11 miles off the North Devon coast, in the Bristol Channel, Lundy Island sits at the point where the Atlantic meets the Channel. It is 3 miles long and half a mile wide. It has its own stamp, its own currency, and its own laws that operated independently of the British Crown for several decades in the 19th century, when the owners simply declared it their own territory. The island has been privately owned for most of its history. Today it is managed by the Landmark Trust, which uses income from holiday lets in the island's historic buildings to fund conservation. Access is by a passenger ferry that runs in season, and the number of visitors is strictly controlled by the limited accommodation available on the island. What makes Lundy relevant to this list is not its eccentric history of self-declared independence. It is the specific layers of what the island holds that most visitors who make the day trip do not encounter. The waters around Lundy contain some of the most significant marine archaeology in the Bristol Channel, including multiple shipwrecks that have never been fully excavated. The island's medieval castle, Morisco Castle, was the base for a dynasty of pirates who terrorized Bristol Channel shipping for generations. One of the Morisco family was hanged and quartered at the Tower of London in 1242 for allegedly plotting to assassinate Henry III. The island's seabird colonies, one of the most significant in the Bristol Channel, obscure the darker dimensions of its history in the tourist presentation. Lundy is beautiful. It is also a place with a specific history of violence, self-declared sovereignty, and maritime crime that the Landmark Trust's tasteful holiday let brochures do not lead with. In the Bristol Channel, closer to the Welsh coast than the English, a small flat island called Flat Holm sits approximately 4 miles from Penarth. It is accessible by boat from Cardiff Bay. It has a lighthouse, a Victorian-era cholera hospital, and a graveyard. The cholera hospital was built in 1884 to serve as a quarantine facility for ships arriving in Cardiff and Bristol that were carrying passengers with cholera. The infected were brought to Flat Holm and held in isolation until they either recovered or died. The graveyard on Flat Holm contains the remains of those who did not recover. The number of people buried there is not precisely established. The graves are not all individually marked. Some of those buried here arrived from ships whose passenger records have been lost. They are buried on an island in the Bristol Channel with no name on a headstone, separated from the mainland by 4 miles of water, for the specific reason that the Victorian city of Cardiff did not want the cholera they were carrying to reach the shore. Flat Holm is accessible to visitors and is managed as a nature reserve. The cholera hospital building survives. The graveyard is maintained. The island is also known as the site where Marconi conducted some of his earliest wireless transmission experiments in 1897. This more positive historical legacy sits alongside the quarantine history in the official interpretation. The unnamed dead in the island graveyard receive less prominence. Between Flat Holm and the Somerset coast, another small island sits in the Bristol Channel. Steep Holm, more dramatic than Flat Holm, its limestone cliffs rising steeply on all sides, accessible only from one small beach. During the Second World War, Flat Holm was fortified as an anti-aircraft battery, part of the Bristol Channel defensive network protecting the ports of Bristol, Cardiff, and Newport from German air attack. The gun emplacements from the 1940s are still there. The radar installation bases are still visible. The military infrastructure of a small island converted into a weapons platform in a matter of months is preserved across the island's surface. But Flat Holm also has a Victorian military history. A Palmerston fort was built here in the 1860s as part of the coastal defence network, responding to the perceived threat of French invasion. The island has therefore been a weapons platform in two separate centuries, and the physical evidence of both periods is present simultaneously. Flat Holm is a nature reserve managed by the Kenneth Allsop Memorial Trust. It is accessible by boat from Weston-super-Mare in season, and day visits are possible but uncommon because the crossing is subject to the significant tidal conditions of the Bristol Channel. Most people on the Weston-super-Mare seafront can see Flat Holm on the horizon and have no idea what is still on it. Off the East Lothian coast in the Firth of Forth, a volcanic rock plug rises 107 meters above the sea. Bass Rock. It is white with gannet colonies, approximately 150,000 birds nesting on the rock at the peak of the season. It looks, from the mainland, like a natural wonder, which it is. It is also the site of one of the most feared prisons in Scottish history. Between 1671 and 1701, Bass Rock was used as a state prison for Covenanter prisoners and later for Jacobite supporters. The conditions were specific to the geography of the rock. The cells were cut into the basalt. The isolation from the mainland was total. The difficulty of escape was absolute. No prisoner escaped from Bass Rock during its period as a prison, with one remarkable exception. In 1691, a small group of Jacobite prisoners managed to seize the rock and held it for 3 years against the government, the last stronghold of the Jacobite cause in Scotland. When Bass Rock was finally handed back, it had been held by a handful of prisoners against the full resources of the British state for 36 months. The rock is now a nature reserve. Boat trips run from North Berwick. The gannet colony is one of the largest in the world and is the primary attraction. The prison history is present in the formal interpretation, but the gannet numbers, rather than the prisoner numbers, lead the visitor experience. 10 miles off the Ayrshire coast in the Firth of Clyde, Ailsa Craig rises 338 meters above the sea. It is a volcanic plug, like Bass Rock, but considerably larger. It was inhabited until 1990, when the last lighthouse keeper left. Before that, various attempts were made over the centuries to establish a permanent, productive community on the island. None succeeded. The island has one significant economic product. The specific blue hone granite from which it is composed is the only material in the world used to make curling stones. Every curling stone used in Olympic competition has been made from Ailsa Craig granite. The quarrying rights are held by a single company, Quays of Scotland. The island is otherwise uninhabited, owned by the Marquess of Ailsa, and accessible only on organised boat trips from Girvan that run when weather permits. The bird life is exceptional, including one of the largest gannet colonies in Britain. The ruins of a medieval monastery and a Napoleonic lookout post are visible on the island. There was also a small Catholic community that used the island as a retreat during the period when Catholicism was suppressed in Scotland. The combination of failed permanent settlement, unique geological identity, global sporting significance, and layered historical occupation makes Ailsa Craig one of the stranger entries on this list. This channel covered Gruinard Island in the video on UK places that were poisoned and never properly cleaned up. It belongs on this list too, in the specific context of what it means to be an island that cannot be approached. Gruinard Island in the northwest Scottish Highlands was used by the British government in 1942 to test anthrax bombs. Sheep were tethered on the island, and anthrax bombs were detonated over them. The sheep died. The anthrax spores survived in the soil. The island was declared contaminated and off-limits. It remained off-limits for 46 years. In 1986, a decontamination operation using formaldehyde solution began. In 1990, a government official walked across the island carrying a piece of turf and declared it safe. The island was formally returned to its pre-war owners' heirs. It has not been inhabited since. The specific question of whether the 1990 decontamination was complete and permanent has never been answered with the directness that the island's 46-year contamination history would appear to require. Anthrax spores can survive in soil for decades or longer under the right conditions. The formal declaration of safety was made. The island remains uninhabited. The Northwest Highland communities that fish the waters around it know what happened there. The tourists on the A832 road, who stop at the viewpoint to photograph it, mostly do not. In the North Atlantic, approximately 300 miles west of the Scottish mainland, a single granite rock rises 21 meters above the sea, Rockall. It is 25 meters wide at its base. It has no fresh water. It has no soil. It has no flat surface large enough to shelter on. It has been the subject of an international territorial dispute involving the United Kingdom, Ireland, Denmark, and Iceland, all of whom have at various points claimed the rights to the sea around it because of the fisheries and potential hydrocarbon reserves in the surrounding waters. The UK formally annexed Rockall in 1955 by sending a Royal Marines detachment to plant a flag and cement a plaque. The annexation was protested by multiple countries. Rockall has been climbed. It has been camped on. Greenpeace activists occupied it for 42 days in 1997 to protest oil exploration in the surrounding waters. A man named Tom McLean lived on it for 40 days in 1985 to establish a record. The legal status of the surrounding sea remains disputed. The rock itself is technically British territory, but no one lives there. No one can practically live there, and the claim to it is maintained largely because of what the surrounding water might contain. Rockall is the British Isles' most absurd territorial possession, a rock in the North Atlantic that nobody can stay on, surrounded by sea that multiple countries are still arguing about. Off the Mull of Kintyre in the Firth of Clyde, a small island called Sanda sits approximately 2 miles from the tip of the Kintyre Peninsula. It is privately owned and has changed hands multiple times. It was listed for sale in 2019 with a lighthouse, a farmhouse, and several cottages. There have been multiple failed attempts to establish sustainable economic activity on the island. Sanda is associated in Scottish tradition with Saint Ninian, who is said to have used it as a retreat in the early Christian period. There is a small chapel ruin associated with this tradition and a holy well. The island also carries a tradition that it is cursed, that those who attempt to profit from it will be frustrated. This tradition is not simply folk legend. The documented history of ownership attempts on Sanda includes a series of ventures that failed under circumstances that, taken individually, are unremarkable and, taken collectively, constitute a pattern that the island's buyers rarely research before purchase. The island sits on a strategically significant shipping lane between the Firth of Clyde and the North Channel. Multiple shipwrecks lie in the surrounding waters. The specific combination of early Christian history, persistent curse tradition, spectacular natural setting, and documented pattern of failed ownership makes Sanda one of the stranger privately owned islands in Britain. In the Firth of Forth, between Edinburgh and Fife, the island of Inchkeith sits approximately 3 miles from both shores. It has a lighthouse, the ruins of a fortification, and a documented history of being used by people who needed to keep something isolated from the mainland. In 1493, King James IV of Scotland sent 2 young children to Inchkeith with a deaf-mute woman to raise them. His purpose was to determine what language children would speak naturally if they never heard human speech. If they spoke Hebrew, the king's theory went, that would prove Hebrew was the original human language given by God. The children were reportedly kept on the island for several years. The chronicle that records this experiment says that the children were later reported to speak good Hebrew. Historians consider this account unreliable. What actually happened to the children is not known. The island was subsequently used as a quarantine station during the Edinburgh plague outbreaks of the 16th century. During the First and Second World Wars, it was fortified as part of the Firth of Forth coastal defence. The military installations from both world wars are still on the island. Inchkeith is not currently accessible to the public. It is owned by the Scottish Government and maintained as a nature reserve. The ruins of the language experiment location, the plague quarantine facilities, and 2 world wars of military installations coexist on a small island 3 miles from Edinburgh that most people who live in Edinburgh have never visited. Off the northwest Highland coast of Sutherland, accessible by a small ferry from Tarbet, Handa Island sits in the Minch. It is now a nature reserve managed by the Scottish Wildlife Trust and is accessible to day visitors by ferry. But between 1841 and 1848, Handa Island was inhabited by a small community of approximately 60 people who operated under their own governance system. The community elected its own queen, the oldest widow on the island, who held court each morning to settle the previous day's disputes. The community had its own parliament. It managed its own food distribution, its own conflict resolution, and its own relationship with the mainland on its own terms. It was, in the strict sense, a functioning micro-democracy on an island off the northwest coast of Scotland. In 1848, the potato famine that was devastating Ireland and the Scottish Highlands simultaneously struck Handa. The community, which depended on potatoes, fish, and seabirds for its diet, could not sustain itself. The decision was made to evacuate. The entire community emigrated to Canada. The island has been uninhabited since. The community governance structure they operated, which gave political authority to the oldest widow and distributed food and justice collectively, has no direct parallel in other documented Scottish island communities of the period. What happened on Handa between 1841 and 1848 is the kind of social experiment that most people interested in alternative governance structures have never heard of. 60 miles north of Cape Wrath, the northernmost point of mainland Britain, an island called North Rona sits in the Atlantic. It is one of the most remote islands in the British Isles. There is no regular ferry service. Access requires a chartered vessel and suitable weather, which rules out most of the year. The island was inhabited from at least the early medieval period. A chapel associated with St Ronan dates to the 8th century. The island supported a small community for centuries through a combination of farming, fishing, and seabird harvesting. And then, twice in documented history, the entire population disappeared. The first documented depopulation occurred in the 18th century when a storm destroyed the island's boats and the harvest simultaneously. The community, cut off from the mainland, starved. When a ship finally called at North Rona, they found the island empty. One version of events suggests that rats from a shipwreck had previously destroyed the food stores, making the community vulnerable before the storm finished the process. The second depopulation occurred in 1844, when the last permanent residents left. The reasons for the second departure are less catastrophically documented, but involve the progressive difficulty of maintaining viable community life in such extreme isolation. North Rona is now a nature reserve. The chapel ruin is still there. The foundations of the community buildings are still there. And the island that lost everyone twice is 60 miles of open ocean from the nearest mainland. And now we have reached number 1. 50 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, in the Atlantic Ocean, the archipelago of St Kilda rises from the sea. The main island of Hirta reaches 430 meters at its highest point. The sea cliffs are among the tallest in Britain. The natural setting is extraordinary. And on the 30th of August 1930, the 36 remaining inhabitants of St Kilda signed a petition requesting evacuation to the Scottish mainland. 2 days later, they were taken off. They left their dogs, their tools, their furniture, their entire physical world. The village on Herta is still there. The cleats, the stone storage structures scattered across the hillsides, are still there. The church and the schoolhouse are still there. The objects the community left behind are still in the buildings. The physical world of a community that had lived on this archipelago for thousands of years was simply left in place on the day they sailed away. This channel covered St Kilda in the video on abandoned UK villages. But St Kilda belongs on this list for a specific reason that goes beyond the abandonment. The evacuation of 1930 is one of the most documented departures in Scottish history, and the more closely you examine the documentation, the less satisfactory the official explanation becomes. The St Kildans were the last inhabitants of one of the most isolated communities in Britain. The British government had been aware of their island's progressive decline for decades. The infrastructure that might have sustained the community, a proper harbour, reliable communication, adequate medical provision, was never built. The question of whether the St Kildans chose to leave or were allowed to decline to the point where leaving was the only option is a question that the official evacuation narrative, which frames the departure as a voluntary decision, has never answered fully. The island is a national nature reserve and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is accessible on wildlife cruises in the summer season, weather permitting. The village is still there, exactly as the 36 people left it, and the full account of why they left is still not settled.